The hall had gone completely still. Not the careful quiet of ceremony, not the rehearsed hush that fell before a king spoke. This was the other kind of silence, the kind that arrives when something unexpected has moved through a room and the room does not yet know what to do with it. 7 council elders sat frozen at the curved dais. The courtiers along the walls had stopped breathing. Even Elder Voss, who had not been interrupted in 12 years of council sessions, had gone pale around the mouth. At the center of the hall, on the cold stone floor below the singer's mark, stood a girl the court had been told did not matter. She had just finished singing, and the Alpha King, Kalen Drest, who had not shown the court a single unguarded expression in all the years he had held the throne, was sitting very still with his hands open on the arms of his chair and something behind his eyes that looked, to anyone who had known his mother, like grief. If you have ever watched someone be told they do not belong in a room, and then watch that room rearrange itself around them, stay with this story. It starts 3 days earlier, at a gate. Nikolai had arrived at the king's hall on the second morning of the week before Midsong, seated in the back of a supply wagon because the debt tribute arrangements from her pack did not include travel coin for the performers. There were 3 packs bound by the old debt arrangement that year, and hers was the smallest. She had known since the age of 14 that she would eventually be sent. Her mother had told her, in the careful way her mother told her most difficult things, while braiding her hair and not quite meeting her eyes in the reflection. Her mother was gone now. 2 winters passed. The braid was Nikolai's, to manage alone. She had been given a room in the lower staff corridor, which was a generous name for what was, in fact, a narrow passage with sleeping alcoves carved into the wall. The other tribute singers from the 3 packs had rooms along the same corridor, though Nikolai noticed that the 2 from the larger packs had been given alcoves with proper curtains. Hers had a hook, where a curtain had once hung. Mira found her there on the first evening, standing on a stool trying to reach the hook to see if there was any possibility of hanging something, anything, over the open alcove. "I have a spare piece," Mira said. She was a kitchen wolf, stocky and direct, with flour along one forearm that she had not noticed. "From the linen count. No one will miss it." Nikolai took it without ceremony, because she had learned that accepting help gracefully was a form of respect for the person offering it. They ate together that evening in the kitchen passage, and Mira told her which council elders preferred silence during the tribute performances, and which ones watched the performers' feet, and which one, Elder Voss, watched everything with the patient attention of a man cataloging weaknesses. "He arranged the tribute list this year," Mira said, with the careful voice people used when naming something dangerous. "He chose which packs would send and what they would send. He likes to choose." Nikolai filed that away. She had not yet learned how precisely that piece of information would matter. The Midsong Council convened on the 4th morning after her arrival. It was one of the oldest pack ceremonies still observed in the hall, a day when the Council of 7 elders received tribute from the bonded packs and conducted the formal business of alliances and debts in the presence of the full court. The Alpha King presided from the high chair at the back of the dais, above the 7 council seats, which put him at an elevation that made it difficult to read his face clearly from the floor. Nikolai suspected this was by design. She had been given her performance instruction the previous evening by a junior council aide, a young man with a tight collar who did not make eye contact while delivering messages. She was to perform The Right of Voices, the formal ceremonial tribute song all 3 packs' singers were expected to deliver in sequence. The words were old, stylized, built for a wide voice with training in pack formal register. Nikolai did not have that training. She had not been trained by her pack for ceremony. She had been sent because she was the best singer they had, which was a different thing entirely. She had spent the night trying to learn the formal verses. By the 3rd hour she had accepted what the words were telling her, which was that she could not convincingly perform them by morning. She could attempt them. She could produce the shapes of the words and something resembling the required intervals, and it would be obvious to every trained ear in that hall that she was reaching for something her voice had never been built toward, or she could sing what her voice knew. She lay in the alcove with the parchment still in her hand and thought about her mother, who had taught her one song and taught it so thoroughly that Nikolai could hear every inflection of it even now, in the dark, in a strange palace, 3 days' wagon ride from home. She did not sleep much. The hall on Midsong morning was a different creature than the hall Nikolai had passed through on arriving. The iron torches had been supplemented with standing candelabras, 12 of them arranged in pairs along the central aisle, and the stone floor had been swept so clean it reflected the light from above. The council elders filed in with ceremony, their gray robes bearing the silver thread of their standing, and took their 7 seats in a curved line before the high chair. The court assembled along the walls, 2 and 3 deep, because Midsong was one of the occasions when attendance was not optional for anyone who held a named position in the hall. Nikolai stood in the tribute alcove to the left of the dais with the 2 other singers, a broad-shouldered young man from the northern pack named Karen, and a woman from the eastern pack whose name she had not caught. They had both rehearsed the right of voices extensively. She could tell by the way they moved their lips in small pre-performance patterns, running the words through silently one more time. She did not run the words. Elder Voss called the council to formal sitting with a flat strike of his staff on the stone. He was a tall man, leaner than authority usually made its favorites, with a face that had learned to express judgment and nothing else. He let his eyes travel the room in a single complete sweep before he spoke. "The Midsong Council convenes," he said, "in the presence of the 7 and under the authority of the throne." He paused. "We receive tribute from the 3 bonded packs, as arranged. The performers will come forward in order of their packs standing." Corin went first, and he was good. His voice carried the formal intervals cleanly, and the elders tracked him with the careful attention of people assessing value received. He finished to a measured silence and retreated to the alcove with the composure of someone who had delivered exactly what was required. The Eastern Pack's singer went second, and she was better, her voice richer, the words sitting naturally in her register. One of the elders nodded once during her performance, which in council ceremony was the equivalent of applause. Then Voss looked at the tribute alcove, and his eyes found Nikolai, and he said, clearly enough for the nearest courtiers to hear, "The dead girl from the southern pack." The phrase moved through the room like a stone dropped in water. Not because it was a formal designation, which it was not, but because of the way Voss said it, with the particular inflection that meant he had chosen the phrase carefully and wanted the room to receive it carefully. Det girl. Not tribute singer, not performer. The word det placed first, the word girl placed second, and the weight of both landing on her before she had taken a single step forward. If you are watching this and you know that feeling, the feeling of being named in a room before you have had any chance to be anything in that room, leave a comment below. This story is for you. Nikolai walked to the mark. She did not rush, and she did not hesitate, because hesitation in a room like that would have been its own kind of statement. She stopped at the mark, which was a worn groove in the center floor stone where generations of tribute singers had stood, and she looked at the council once, a full sweep from left to right, and then she looked at the floor in front of her feet, the way singers did when they were going inward to find the note. She found it. It was not the formal interval of the right of voices. It was the first note of the lullaby her mother had sung to her every evening until Nikolai was old enough to be embarrassed by it, and then, some years later, old enough to be grateful. The song had no formal pack name. Her mother had called it the river song because it moved the way rivers moved, unhurried, finding the lowest path, carrying everything it touched along with it. It was built in a minor key that most formal tribute songs avoided, because minor keys suggested loss, and the council preferred to be offered reverence rather than grief. But the grief was honest, and Nikolai had never learned to make her voice say something different from what it meant. She sang 3 measures before she realized the room had changed. It was not a sound change. The hall was already quiet. What changed was the quality of the attention. The difference between people watching and waiting for a thing to end, and people who had stopped waiting for anything because what was currently happening had caught them in a way they had not prepared for. She did not look at the high chair. She had promised herself on the walk from the tribute alcove that she would not look at the high chair, because whatever was up there was above her standing and above her concern, and she had enough to manage with the song. She kept her eyes on the middle distance, the way her mother had taught her, fixed on nothing, open to everything. She sang the second verse, which her mother had always said was the harder one, because the melody climbed and then came down again by a different path, and the descent required the singer to give something up. Nikolai gave it up. She had practice with that. The third verse was the one that ended in silence instead of resolution, a held note that simply stopped, as if the river had found the sea and no longer needed to move. She stopped. The silence lasted 4 full seconds, which in a formal council setting was an enormous amount of time. Nikolai kept her eyes on the middle distance. She heard the small movements of the court reasserting themselves, a breath, a fabric shift, the soft sound of someone's boot heel adjusting on stone. She heard from above and to the right, from the direction of the high chair, nothing at all. It was the nothing that told her something had happened. Formal silence from the high chair meant deliberate composure, but this was a different quality. The silence of a man who had been caught at something and was very carefully choosing not to move. She did not look up. Aaron, the king's beta, who had stood in that position behind the high chair through more council sessions than he could count, watched the king's hands go still on the chair arms and understood with the particular clarity that came from long observation that something in this room had just reached Kaelin in a place where authority could not follow. Aaron filed that away with the sealed composure of a man who knew when to say nothing. Voss was not quiet. "The tribute singer has failed to deliver the required ceremony," he said, and his voice carried the practiced weight of a man who had managed councils for longer than most of the courtiers had been alive. The right of voices was the designated form. What was offered was a personal piece, informal and beneath the occasion. The Southern Pack's tribute is therefore unaccepted. A murmur moved along the walls. Not disagreement exactly. More the sound of people registering that something was happening that they would need to remember. Nikolai turned to face Voss directly. She had not planned this. She had planned to accept the ruling and return to the alcove and figure out what came next from there. But the word unaccepted landed in her chest with a particular pressure, and she found that her voice had opinions about it. "I sang what was true," she said. The hall absorbed the words. "The Right of Voices was not a song I could have given honestly this morning. I gave what I could give honestly. If the council considers honesty insufficient, I accept that judgment. But I will not recant the song itself." Voss looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been handed a tool he already knew exactly how to use. "The debt girl refuses correction," he said, not to Nikolai, but to the room. "The Southern Pack's tribute is unaccepted, and I will move that their existing debt be doubled as a consequence of deliberate ceremonial defiance." The word doubled moved through Nikolai like cold water. Her pack was a small one, 14 families along a river valley, and their existing debt to the Crown arrangement was already the kind of number that made winters difficult. Doubled meant something that could not be recovered in her lifetime. Doubled meant the debt became the pack's defining fact, the thing every child born there would inherit. She kept her face still. She had practice with that too. She had not looked at the high chair this time either, which meant she missed the moment when Kaelin's hands shifted on the chair arms, fingers closing briefly around the carved stone before releasing. Aaron saw it. Aaron had seen everything from the moment the girl had opened her mouth and the first 3 notes of the river song had reached the high chair and done something to the king that 12 years of grief management had apparently not prepared him for. Voss surveyed the council for the second he needed. "I require a second," he said. Elder Thornwall, the council's second voice on debt proceedings, who had seconded Voss on 43 motions over the course of his tenure, opened his mouth. And from the high chair, without raising his voice, Kalen said, "Hold." The word was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the kind of word that rearranged air. Voss turned his head toward the high chair with the expression of a man who had not been interrupted in this room in longer than he cared to count, and was now assessing what exactly had just occurred. "My lord," Voss said, with the measured tone of a man recalibrating. "Ceremonial defiance by a tribute singer is within the council's jurisdiction to address." "The motion has not been seconded," Kalen said. "It will not proceed until I have asked the tribute singer a question." Voss's mouth closed. He did not press further, which was itself a kind of information. He pressed on everything, always. The fact that he did not press here meant he was calculating something rather than reacting to it. Kalen descended 2 steps from the high chair. He did not come all the way down to the floor, which would have been unusual. He stopped at the level of the council dais, which put him above the floor but below the throne position, and he looked at Nikolai across the length of the hall with a steadiness that made the room hold its breath. "Where did you learn that song?" he said. Nikolai felt the question land differently than questions usually landed. Not as an interrogation, as something else. She had time to notice that his voice was lower than she had expected, and that it carried a quality she had no name for, the quality of a man asking something he already half knew the answer to, and was asking anyway, because the answer needed to exist in the air between them, named and certain. "From my mother," she said. "Her name?" "Rena. She served in this hall for a year before I was born. I do not know her full station during that service. She never spoke of it as anything significant." The small clause of that sentence, "before I was born," settled into Kalen's chest with the weight of 12 years and a closed room. He knew the name Rena. He had been 11 years old the year a kitchen wolf named Rena had learned the river song from his mother, who had taught it to anyone who would receive it in the last winter she was well enough to sing, because she had wanted the song to continue past her. He had not known Rena had a daughter. He had not known the song had traveled south in the hands of a woman who carried it home to a river valley and taught it to a child who would grow up not knowing what she carried. He stood on the dais step and said nothing for a moment. Voss, who had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of a man realizing that his calculated arrangement was developing complications, moved. "This is a matter of tribute procedure," Voss said, sharply enough that 2 of the sidewall courtiers shifted. "The performer's parentage does not alter the ceremonial deficiency. My motion stands." "Your motion has not been seconded," Kalen said, without looking away from Nikolai. "And it will not be seconded today." That sentence rewrote something in the room. Thornwall, who had been waiting for the cue, sat back in his chair with the small private recalculation of a man who understood political weather. He had seconded Voss for a long time. He also seconded the king when the king expressed a position, and the king had just expressed a position with the particular clarity that meant it was not a position, but a fact. Voss understood what had happened. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a new temperature, something harder underneath the formal register. "The tribute singer was placed before this council as a specific instrument," Voss said, and the room caught that word, instrument, in the way that rooms caught words that revealed more than they intended. "The Southern Pax debt tribute was arranged to serve this council's function. If the arrangement is set aside by the throne's preference, the throne assumes responsibility for the Southern Pact's entire debt balance. That is also council procedure." Nikolai heard the shape of what Voss had just said. heard the word arranged and the word instrument, and understood for the first time that she was not a mistake in this room. She had been placed here deliberately by someone who had wanted something to go wrong. She did not yet know what. But the air in the room had the particular charge of a plan failing in front of the person who had made it. Aaron moved. He had been standing behind the high chair for the entire session with the composed stillness of someone who knew exactly when the right moment arrived. He came down from the dais level with a measured, unhurried step and crossed to the space beside Kaelin. In his hand was a sealed document, the seal already broken, the contents visible to him and not yet to the room. "My lord," Aaron said, and his voice carried the formal weight of information that had been prepared for this specific moment. "The council may wish to know that the tribute arrangement for this year's midsong was structured by Elder Voss in correspondence with the household of Sable Maren, whose family has been seeking a formal claiming arrangement between Sable Maren and the throne for 3 years. I hold the sealed correspondence. The Southern Pack's tribute was placed last on the list and assigned the most demanding ceremonial requirement, with the apparent intention that their tribute would fail. The failure would give Elder Voss grounds to double the Southern Pack's debt and use that leverage as a demonstration to the throne that Voss controls the council's debt function. Sable Marin's family was to be present this evening, when the claiming arrangement was to be offered as the resolution to the manufactured debt pressure. The hall did not murmur. The hall did nothing. The kind of silence that followed Aaron's words was the silence of a room processing something it could not immediately absorb. Voss's composure was the work of 30 years in political chambers. Even now it held, more or less, but the mouth, which was the first place composure failed in trained faces, had gone a fraction tighter. And 2 of the council elders on his left had moved their chairs, the small physical displacement of people separating themselves from something that was about to become associated with a name they did not want near theirs. "The document can be read into the council record," Aaron said, still even, still measured. "Or it can be reviewed privately by the remaining 6 elders. The correspondence is dated and sealed in Voss's own hand and in the hand of the Marin household steward." Elder Thornwall spoke, and it was the first independent sentence he had managed in a council session in longer than anyone present could precisely remember. "I withdraw my standing to second any motion by Elder Voss in this session," he said, pending review of the correspondence. Voss turned to Kaelin with the expression of a man who has played every piece he had and has arrived at the edge of the board. "The throne is leveraging fabricated correspondence to protect a tribute singer's breach," Voss said, and his voice had the quality now of something stripped of its outer layer. "I have served this council for 30 years. I will not be made an instrument of the throne's personal preferences." "You used the word instrument," Kaelin said. "Earlier. You used it about her." The room understood what that comparison meant. Voss's own word, returned to him in the exact place it would do the most precise damage. Kaelin descended the final 2 steps to the hall floor. He was not a tall man in the way that authority sometimes manufactured height, through elevation and ceremony and the angle of the light. He was simply present, in the way that very few people were present in a room, in the way that made the room acknowledge him before he spoke. He walked the length of the hall floor toward the singer's mark where Nikolai was still standing. She had watched him come down from the dais, and she had kept her breathing even and her hands still at her sides, and she had told herself that whatever was about to happen was political and above her, and would involve her only as an instrument of something she could not control. She had believed that, mostly, until he stopped 1 pace away from the singer's mark and looked at her directly. And she understood from the quality of his looking that he was not thinking about the council or Voss or the political architecture of the room at all. He was thinking about a song. "Your mother carried something out of this hall that she taught to you without telling you what it was," he said, quietly enough that the front row of courtiers heard it but the back did not. "She learned it from my mother. In the last year my mother was well. I was 11 years old. I have not heard it since. Nikolai held very still. She heard the words, and she heard what was under them. 12 years of a grief managed so precisely and for so long that a single song could reach through it and find the unguarded place beneath. She thought about her own mother, who had spent a year in this hall before the year Nikolai was born, and had come home with a song she sang every evening and never explained, a song she had apparently learned from a queen who was dying and wanted the music to survive. The back of her throat tightened. She breathed through it. She sang it beautifully, Nikolai said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. I was never as good as she was. Something in his face, the last portion of the formal expression, released. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet way things released when they had been held too long, a breath let out, a hand unclenched. He turned to face the hall, not the council. The hall. All of it. The courtiers along the walls, the 7 elders frozen in their seats, the candles in their pairs, the high stone ceiling catching the torchlight above. I claim this woman, he said, in his formal voice, the voice that assumed compliance not through volume, but through the gravity of the person using it, as my chosen. Under the laws of the Midsong Council, a formal claiming by the throne supersedes any existing tribute arrangement, debt instrument, or political alliance negotiated in the council's name. He paused. The Southern Pact's debt is dissolved. The correspondence held by my beta will be reviewed by the remaining 6 elders, and Elder Voss will be suspended from council proceedings pending that review. Voss stood. He had no more moves, and he appeared to know it. But a man who had held power for 30 years did not sit quietly when it left him. The throne cannot claim a debt girl in open council and call it law, he said. She has no standing. She has no bloodline recorded with this hall. She is nothing this council is required to acknowledge. The third time he had used her station as a word, the third careful placing of her low standing in the mouth of the room that had watched every step of this. Her bloodline, Kaelin said, will be recorded as of this session. Her mother served this hall. That service will be entered into the hall's records, which were never formally closed, because no one thought to ask whether they were complete. He looked at Voss without expression. I am asking now. Thornwall wrote it down. The scratch of the quill on the record page was audible in the silence. Sable Marin, who had been seated in the gallery above the council floor since the session's opening, having been brought to the hall by her family steward on the understanding that this evening's events would end with a claiming in her favor, rose from her seat and left the gallery without a word. There was no drama in her exit. The arrangement she had come for had ceased to exist, and she was too composed by upbringing to dramatize a loss she had not yet publicly claimed. Her family's steward, sitting beside the empty gallery seat, stared at the floor. Mira, who had no business being in a council session but had slipped into the back of the hall when word reached the kitchen corridor that something unusual was happening, stood 3 rows deep along the western wall, with her hands pressed over her mouth and her eyes very bright. Aaron crossed the floor and delivered the sealed correspondence to Elder Thornwall, who received it with both hands and the particular care of a man who understood he was holding the instrument of his own long political recalibration. 5 of the 6 remaining elders turned their chairs toward the record table in a wordless alignment. The 6th, the elder who had closed her eyes during Nikolai's singing, remained turned toward the hall floor. Voss, with the last composure he had, stood from his council seat, set his staff on the table with a sound that rang in the stone ceiling, and walked from the hall. He did not look at Nikolai as he passed. He looked at nothing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Nikolai had not moved from the singer's mark. The hall was still in a way it had not been for any of the formal portions of the session. The claiming had been witnessed. The correspondence was in hand. The debt line in the record book was either being altered or already had been. She could not see from where she stood. All the political machinery of the room was doing what political machinery did when it recognized that a decision had been made above it, turning slowly to accommodate the new fact. She was still standing on the worn groove in the center floor stone. Kalen stood one pace away, and his hand was open at his side, extended slightly toward her, palm upward, fingers apart. Not reaching, not demanding. Simply open, in the way that an invitation differs from an order by the precise quality of its stillness. Nikolai looked at the hand. She thought about her mother, who had spent a year in this hall and carried a song home and taught it to a daughter, and never explained where it came from. She thought about the river valley and the 14 families and the debt that had sent her here, which no longer existed. She thought about the alcove with the hook where the curtain had once hung, and the wool cloth Mira had pressed into her hands, and the night she had lain in the dark deciding whether to be honest or safe. She had chosen honest. It had cost her, briefly, everything. It had returned to her. She was beginning to understand. Something larger than what she had given up. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed. Not hard, not performing the gesture for the room. Simply closed. The way something closes when it has finally been returned to the place it was looking for. The hall exhaled. Mira, at the back wall, made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, but lived in the space between them, and pressed her forehead briefly against the shoulder of the courtier standing beside her, who happened to be Corin, the Northern Pack's tribute singer, who had delivered the right of voices correctly and completely, and would remember for the rest of his life that he had been present in the hall on the morning a debt girl from the south had sung a river song and changed what the room was required to believe. In the days that followed, the council's record was amended to include a full accounting of the service of a kitchen wolf named Rena, who had spent 1 year in the king's hall 12 years before Midsong, who had received a song from the queen in the last winter of the queen's life, and who had carried it south to a river valley where she had sung it every evening to a daughter who grew up knowing it was beautiful without knowing why it mattered. The Southern Pack's debt was closed and sealed with the council's formal mark. The correspondence between Elder Voss and the Marin household steward took 3 days to review. What it contained was not materially different from what Aaron had summarized in the hall, though it was more explicit in its architecture than most of the elders had been fully prepared for. Voss's removal from the council was formalized at a closed session of the remaining 6, which also voted to review the debt arrangements for all 3 bonded packs for the previous 7 years, on the grounds that any arrangement structured by a single elder without independent review required examination. Mira received an assigned kitchen position with a room that had a curtain already hung. Aaron was rarely surprised by anything the king did. He had known Kalen through the years that followed the queen's death, through the construction of authority that the grief had required, through every council session and every political arrangement, and every winter morning when the high chair needed to be occupied by someone who gave nothing away. He had watched Kalen manage the cost of the throne for 12 years with the specific, patient competence of a man who believed the cost was simply the nature of the thing. He had watched Nikolai's hands go still at the singer's mark while Voss named her low, standing for the second and then the third time. And he had watched Kalen's hands do something on the chair arms that Aaron had never seen them do in 12 years of sessions, and he had thought, with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose private understanding of things had just been confirmed, that the river song had found its way to the one room in the world it had been, without anyone planning it, always aimed toward. The hall remembered the morning of Midsong in the way that halls remember the things that happened in them, which could not be explained fully by any single account. The candles had burned steadily. The stone floor had held the sound of one voice in a minor key. 7 elders had been seated, and 1 had lost his chair. A claiming had been made in front of the full court by a king who had not previously made any public claim on anything he valued personally. What the court understood, in the way that courts understood things that were shown to them rather than told, was that something the throne had been carrying quietly for 12 years had found, in the worst designed act of political manipulation Voss had managed, an unexpected resolution. The river song had left this hall in the hands of a woman who wanted it to continue. It had continued south, and grown, and returned. Nikolai stood at the window of the room she had been given, which was not in the lower staff corridor. Below her, the courtyard where the supply wagon had stopped 3 days before was empty in the early evening light, the iron gate at its far end standing open. She had a curtain now. She had more than a curtain. She was not yet sure what the full shape of the moor was, and she was patient with not knowing, because she had been patient with harder uncertainties. She thought about her mother, who had been 19 years old in this hall, who had received a song from a dying queen and carried it home without understanding that the song was a kind of lineage, a thread running from one woman's voice to another's across 12 years and a great deal of ordinary grief. Her mother had not known what she was carrying. Nikolai had not known either, until the song had left her mouth in a stone hall in front of 7 council elders and done what songs do when they find the person who has been waiting without knowing they were waiting. A knock, quiet and unhurried. She turned. Kalen stood in the doorway. He had shed the formal council robe, and without it, he looked less like the architecture of authority and more like a person who had carried something heavy for a long time and had, very recently, set part of it down. He was watching her with the same quality of attention she had first noticed in the hall, the attention of a man who was not performing watching, but actually doing it. "I wanted to say," he said and stopped, and the stopping was not uncertainty. It was the care of a person selecting words that were the right weight for the thing they were carrying. "Your mother sang it the same way. The descent in the second verse, giving something up." Nikolai held the words for a moment. "She always said that was the harder part," she said. He nodded once, the nod of someone who had known that and had needed to hear it spoken by another voice. He did not come further into the room. She did not need him to. There was time, and the things that required time were patient by their nature. She had given up the formal song and sung the true one, and the true one had reached the room it was meant for, and the room had changed around it. Her hand rested open on the stone sill. His hand, when it lifted slightly at his side in the doorway, was open too. The river had found the sea.